Hi everybody! This video provides a little bit of background on the stories that you'll be reading for this week. The first story I'm going to talk a little bit about is The Open Boat by Stephen Crane. This story was originally published in 1897, so it's over 100 years old. The story is based on Crane's newspaper article describing a shipwreck that he actually survived in 1896. However, unlike the newspaper article, which stressed the events that occurred before the ship sank, this short story is inspired by the surviving crew member's struggle to reach land in a 10-foot boat. So while it isn't an exact recount of Crane's experiences, it is based on a real event that Crane himself experienced. And as you're reading this, I have some questions that I want you to be thinking about. And if you're paying attention to these and taking notes on these questions as you read the story, it will help you a lot when you get to both the quiz and the discussion for this week. So these questions begin with the question, how does the narrator characterize the ocean? What specific words and images does he use? And what feelings and ideas do these choices evoke? So this asks you to think about how the ocean is described and sort of what kinds of ideas or feelings these descriptions evoke and how and what ideas and feelings might be associated with the ocean. And then related to that, I also want you to think about the characters' attitudes towards the ocean. And then along with that, what kind of attitude do they seem to have about nature, more generally speaking. And then I have a little bit more specific question. In part 4 of the story, the correspondent, who's one of the characters, remembers a part of a poem about a soldier in Algiers. So I want you to especially pay attention when you get to that part of the story, and I want you to think about how his sort of experience of what's happening in the boat changes his understanding of the poem. So he sort of thinks about this poem and thinks about some sort of parallels, and it sort of shifts his view of what's happening to him. So I want you to pay attention to that and think about how it sort of changes the correspondent's understanding of his experience. And then finally, along with that, I want you to think about how the poem foreshadows the end of the story. And then the second story that you'll be reading for this week is Sonny's Blues by James Baldwin. This story is set in Harlem, which you may remember from when we talked about the Harlem Renaissance with Langston Hughes. However, it's important to note that this story is not set during the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance occurred during the 1920s and 1930s, and during that period of time, Harlem was a fairly sort of vibrant community that certainly probably had its problems, but was also, fairly sort of economically vibrant. This story takes place about 20 to 30 years after the Harlem Renaissance, in the 1950s. And this was a time when middle-class Black families were moving out of Harlem, and also a lot of sort of the locally owned businesses were sort of losing local ownership as well. So this is sort of a time when there was an economic downturn in Harlem, and there were very few economic opportunities, very few jobs, or opportunities to really sort of economically advance yourself for those people who remained. And because of that sort of economic downturn, the community became a hotbed for drug trafficking and other kinds of social problems. So the Harlem that we're reading about in this story is very different from the one that Langston Hughes was living in and thinking about when he was writing his poems that we read earlier this semester. And then this setting plays an important role in the story, as various characters are struggling to escape from and survive and cope this environment that is not optimal. And I also have some questions that I want you to think about when you're reading the story. And once again, these questions should help you both with the quiz and then also with the discussion that you'll be doing this week. So the first question is about how Harlem is characterized. So what kind of words, images, language, and figures of speech does the narrator use to describe Harlem? And what does this language suggest about his feelings towards Harlem? So, how does he feel about Harlem? What's his attitude towards Harlem? And then the second question has to do with one of the central themes of the story, which is suffering. So I want you to pay attention to the kinds of emotional pain and trauma that each of the characters encounter, and then also how they cope with that trauma. It's a question of how do people cope with trauma, whether that's emotional trauma, family trauma, or racial trauma. Is a sort of central question that goes through this story, so I want you to be paying attention to that. And related to that is this theme of music, especially jazz. So one of the main characters in the story, Sonny, is drawn to jazz. So I want you to pay attention to why he's drawn to it, and then how the narrator, what his initial view of jazz is and how his attitude towards it changes. And then finally, I want you to be thinking about these two central characters, the narrator, and then his brother, Sonny. So be thinking about, how they're different from each other. And then what aspects of Sonny does the narrator find confusing, and how the narrator's understanding of Sonny changes over the course of the story. So that's it as far as background on these stories go. I hope you enjoy them, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you have to say about them.